Okay, I think we'll begin. Good evening and welcome to this virtual community information meeting about York Region's new growth forecast to 2051. My name is Marg Wooters and I'm the Senior Manager Policy and Research with the Planning Department at the City of Markham. The purpose of this meeting is to provide information and an opportunity to get feedback from you on the region's proposed growth forecast to 2051. This forecast will form the basis of how the region and the city plan for growth over the next 35 years, and it will be reflected in both the region's and Markham's official plan. The region is seeking comments on this forecast, and this consultation is one of the opportunities for Markham residents to voice their opinion about how Markham should grow. The comments we receive will inform the preparation of the city's comments to the region on the forecast, which will be presented in a report to Markham Council in June. And I'll touch on that again at the end of the meeting. This meeting will consist of two presentations and a question and answer period. Paul Bottomley from York Region will provide the first presentation, which will provide an overview of the forecast from a regional perspective. And then I will share a presentation which outlines Markham staff's initial comments on the forecast. There will be opportunity for questions after Paul's presentation and then again after my presentation. If you wish to comment or ask a question as part of this meeting, please use the raise hand tool, which you will find by clicking on the participants icon on the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. And one of our facilitators will call your name at the appropriate time. As a courtesy to others, please mute your microphone and turn off your video during the meeting unless you are called upon. And as we just heard, today's session is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube. Please keep your webcam off if you wish to remain off camera. So before I ask Paul Bottomley to begin his presentation, I would like to acknowledge the following members of council and staff that are with us this evening. We have with us, at my last count, we had Mayor Scarpitti, Deputy Mayor Don Hamilton, Ward 3 Councillor Reid McAlpine, Ward 5 Councillor Andrew Keys, and Ward 8 Councillor Issa Lee. And if there are any others, I'll try to catch up with that later. We also have from Markham staff, Bijou Karamancheri, Director of Planning and Urban Design, and also Acting Commissioner of Development Services, as well as Lloyd Chia, Acting Director of Engineering, and Development Managers. Some from our development team will also be with us to answer questions. So the program, as I mentioned, is for two presentations. One will be the overview of York Region forecast, which Paul will be about to give, followed by my presentation on Markham staff comments, and then questions and discussions, and then next steps. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll ask Paul Bottomley, Manager of Policy Research and Forecasting with York Region, to provide the overview of the York Region forecast.
Thank you, Marg. Welcome, everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So as Mark said, I'm Paul Bottomley, the Manager of Policy Research Forecasting in Long Range at the Region, Long Range Planning. And this work forms part of the region's official plan update and conformity work to the growth plan. So what I'm going to be presenting this evening is some material that was actually presented back to regional council back on March the 18th. And so the presentation is a version of that material. I will be covering the items listed on the slide. So the results of the land needs assessment work that the region undertook, the proposed urban expansion mapping that are a component of those results. I'll be touching on the forecast by local municipality, including for the city of Markham. And there's also a section I will be covering with respect to the importance of an integrated growth management approach and phasing of growth moving forward out to 2051. And I will conclude with next steps, giving you all an update with respect to where the region is at in its municipal comprehensive review process. So the provincial growth plan forecasts for the region call for the region to attract the largest share of growth in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area out to 2051. And you can see the purple figure on York Region's map, the 22%. That's the highest growth share in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. As I mentioned, it's slightly above the shares for Peel and Toronto. And the figure to the left of that 27% share, just shows the region's historical growth. So that's from 1986 to 2016, and the region was second only to Peel region during that time. And you can also see the figures on the bottom right of this particular slide. That's the region's 2051 forecast. It's 2.02 million people and 990,000 jobs, and that represents growth of 880,000 people and 345,000 jobs over the next 30 years. So when we plan for growth, we are required to conform to provincial plans, and listed on the slide are several of these provincial documents, and they provide direction to municipalities throughout the entire Greater Golden Horseshoe, and they include the growth plan, as well as the provincial land needs assessment methodology. And all municipalities in the Golden Horseshoe are required to conform to growth plan policy, to growth plan targets, as well as use this mandated provincial methodology to calculate land needs out to 2051. The province has also been very clear that urban areas cannot be expanded into the Greenbelt, and staff's land needs work is in line with that particular provincial direction. So the growth plan's planning horizon, it's been extended out to 2051, as I mentioned, and this is the first time in the province that the planning horizon is in fact 30 years. Previously, municipalities were planned out to a 20-year planning horizon. I also mentioned, of course, that it's a mandated methodology that we have to use to calculate land needs. So the work that I'm going to present to you is a result of that mandated method that comes down from the province. And the method's premised on achieving two key targets from the growth plan, and the 50% minimum intensification target that applies to growth within the existing built-up area throughout the region. And there's also a 50 people and jobs per hectare designated greenfield area density target. And that applies to communities outside the built-up area that lie within the region's existing approved urban area. The provincial method also places a lot of emphasis on a market-based approach in determining future housing needs. So in that regard, the region retained Watson Consulting to assess the housing market in the region, and Watson's commentary provided input into the region's housing type forecast out to 2051. So this slide shows the results of the land needs assessment work. 2,300 hectares of community land are required out to 2051, and 1,100 hectares of employment land. And this slide includes some of the key assumptions behind the analysis. And I'm going to quickly walk through these assumptions from a high level. So for community land needs, the region's population growth of 800,000, that translates into roughly 305,000 units moving forward out to 2051. And half of those units, or roughly half, have to be accommodated within the existing built-up area, as I mentioned, in order to reach the 50% intensification target. Most of the remaining amount is distributed to the designated greenfield area, and that's the area where a demand-supply analysis is undertaken to determine whether an urban expansion is required out to 2051. And as part of that demand supply analysis, the region's forecast demand of units does in fact exceed the supply of units in the region's approved urban area. and that triggers the need for an urban expansion. And as mentioned, the end result is 2,300 hectares of community land. And just to get a picture of that, some people may picture that a little clearer in terms of a concession block. It represents just under 6 concession blocks of land. For employment land purposes, the region's employment forecast is distributed into 4 employment types. There's major office, there's population-related employment, there's some small jobs in the rural area, and there's also our traditional employment areas. These are jobs in our industrial, in our business parks, and it's that particular category that's key to determining future employment land requirements. So regional staff have completed a considerable amount of work looking at employment trends and automation potential by sector to help determine employment growth by type. And you can see on the slide, there's a quick summary of that analysis. So rapid growth in knowledge-based sectors, in transportation, in warehousing industries, modest growth in manufacturing, and declines in retail is a quick summary of anticipated trends moving forward. Staff also looked at the impact of COVID-19 and the impact on the economy. So it was also considered, but the full extent of the pandemic over the long term, it's not yet well understood. So greater emphasis on our work was placed on the trends that I just mentioned, trends in fact that have been evolving over the last several years. And once again, the demand supply analysis for employment areas tells us that 1,100 hectares of urban expansion land is needed for job growth out to 2051. And that equates to just under 3 concession blocks of land. So when we add the 2,300 hectares of community land to the 1,100 hectares for employment, that totals 3,400 hectares of land required to accommodate growth in the region out to 2051. So aside from urban expansion, I mentioned there's a 50% intensification target. So 50% of the region's growth is planned within the existing built-up area, and that includes growth within the region's 4 urban growth centers. There's 78 major transit station areas along the region's corridors. There's also other infill areas that can accommodate intensification within the existing built-up area. And for Markham, of course, there's the 2 urban growth centers, the Markham Center and Langstaff Center. And there's also 21 other major transit station areas. And all of these areas will contribute towards the region's intensification target. Since 2006, the housing market in the region has in fact been delivering 50% intensification. Regional council and senior levels of government have invested a lot of money in transit infrastructure over the last number of years. In fact, $3.2 billion has been invested in bus rapid transit as well as the Spadina subway extension. And this investment has acted as a catalyst for growth in the built-up area. And of course, moving forward, we also have the $5.6 billion Young North Subway extension project that will provide further opportunities for intensification moving forward. I mentioned Watson Consulting and the assessment that they undertook on the region's housing market. And they also concluded that 50% intensification for a region-wide target is an appropriate target to plan for out to 2051. So there's 3 geographic areas in the region, and they're typically known as white belt lands, and they're identified on white in the map before you. And these are the areas that can accommodate urban expansion. They include the Markham, Wichita-Stouffville area in the southeast, the Vaughan King area in the southwest of the region, and East Gwillimbury in the north. And as I mentioned, 3,400 hectares of urban expansion land are needed by 2051. And that number represents about 80% of the available white belt lands. Of course, over the long term, beyond 2051, all of the white belt land will be needed for growth. But in considering locations for 80% of these lands, regional staff completed a cost per capita analysis looking at the full build out of each of these 3 white belt geographies. And the purpose of this cost per capita analysis was really to inform council and the public of transportation and water and wastewater costs for each area, recognizing that in addition to these costs, there are large-scale region-wide infrastructure projects, such as the Duffin Creek Treatment Plant expansion, that will also be required to support growth in any one of these geographies. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the cost per capita analysis, and starting with the southeast part of the region. This area can support growth of 85,000 people, 20,000 jobs at a cost per capita of $4,600. And preliminary infrastructure costs are estimated at around $480 million for this area of the region. Moving on to the southwest part of the region, that can support growth of 90,000 people, 40,000 jobs at a cost per capita of $6,900. And preliminary infrastructure costs are estimated at $900 million for this part of the region. And growth in Northern York is planned to be serviced by the Upper York Servicing Solution. That provides wastewater capacity for East Gwillimbury, as well as parts of Newmarket. And it's an entirely new investment that does require multiple phases of expansion. And to support the long-term growth target of 150,000 people, 55,000 jobs in Northern York, the cost per capita is $7,600. And the infrastructure costs for this area are estimated at $1.6 billion. So the next three slides present staff's proposal for urban expansion locations to 2051. And these were the proposed urban expansion locations that were presented to Regional Council back in March. And I'm going to start with the proposed geography in the southeast. So this includes all of the Whitebelt lands. And the slide details the proposed distribution of land uses for community uses in orange, employment uses in purple, within Markham and Wichita-Stouffville. And you can see the table in the lower left. It includes the proposed urban expansion area, as well as the land use distribution in hectares. So for Markham, 1,490 hectares of developable land in the Whitebelt is available for growth. And of that amount, 1,270 hectares is being proposed for community land, and an additional 220 hectares for employment land. And when we look at opportunities and challenges for this part of the region, on the opportunity side, Southeast York is closest to downstream water and wastewater infrastructure that was invested in the region over the last 10 years, and future growth takes advantage of that previous investment. This area also includes the future employment lands adjacent to Markham's existing employment lands in the vicinity of Highway 404. And on the challenges side, housing affordability poses the most significant risk. It's in this particular area. In fact, housing affordability is a risk that's prevalent across all of Southern York region. The price of ground-related homes, for example, may be problematic for young families, and this in turn may impact the pace of growth and the recovery of development charges. So the proposed geography of urban expansion in the southwest part of the region includes, once again, all of the Whitebelt lands, and the table in the lower left shows the land use distribution in hectares for Vaughan and for King. It also shows the proposed alignment for the GTA West corridor on the map. Once again, on the opportunity side, Southwest York also leverages the downstream water and wastewater investment that was made over the past 10 years. This area also provides well-located employment lands represented in purple on the map along Highway 427, as well as along the planned GTA West corridor. And these employment areas can build on existing strengths in the transportation and logistics sectors. On the flip side, some of this future job growth may take longer to materialize. It's contingent on the timing of the GTA West corridor and may also require water and wastewater upgrades. And like Southeast York, the price of housing may also impact the pace of growth and development charge collections in this area of the region. So moving on to Northern York, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the timing of the Upper York Servicing Solution that's going to provide wastewater services to this part of the region. And the proposed urban expansion in this area includes 180 hectares of community land up to Mount Albert Road except for a portion of land just west of Yonge Street that's being left out. The proposed expansion also includes around 65 hectares of employment land along Highway 404. The Upper York servicing solution is currently scheduled for completion in 2028. And once in operation, the facility provides capacity for 90,000 people in East Gwillimbury, as well as parts of Northwest Newmarket. It further allows for a transfer of capacity to service growth of 30,000 people in Newmarket and Aurora. I mentioned that the timing and the uncertainty of servicing in this area is a key factor that in fact informed the amount of urban expansion in East Gwillimbury. That being said, Northern York typically does provide more affordable housing options in the region, making this an area an attractive location for young families that are interested in moving into York region. So I've discussed the land needs assessment results and the proposed geography for urban expansion, and I'm now going to move on to a little more detail on the proposed local municipal forecasts. So this starting with this slide that shows the 2016 population in blue and the 2051 forecast population in red for each of the 9 municipalities in the region. And growth is expected to be driven by different factors for each. And similar to historic trends, the majority of the growth is forecast for Southern York. In fact, it's a 74% share. And the graph shows the scale of growth for Markham and for Vaughan, as well as for Richmond Hill. And of course, Southern York has access to rapid transit, and growth is anticipated to be driven by significant intensification. And both Markham and Vaughan will also experience a significant amount of greenfield growth. You can see that Markham's forecast for 2051 is 619,200 people, and that's up from roughly 352,000 today. So that's growth of roughly 267,000 for the city, rather. In East Gwillimbury, Georgina King, Richard Stovall, growth will be driven largely by greenfield development with smaller amounts of infill and intensification, whereas most of the growth in Newmarket will be intensification. Of course, Newmarket has access to a regional center and bus rapid transit, while growth in the town of Aurora will be a fairly even mix of both greenfield and intensification units. So this graph illustrates housing growth from 2016 to 2051, once again for all 9, and it shows intensification within the built-up area in blue, and it compares that growth to the designated greenfield area in pink. So intensification targets by municipality are also shown. They're expressed as a percentage of their total forecast growth. Targets range from a high of 86% in Newmarket to 77% in Richmond Hill to 3% in East Gwillimbury. And the information clearly shows the large number of forecasted intensification units in the city of Markham. So in fact, 50,000 units are forecast for Markham for intensification. There's also 49,000 in the city of Vaughan and 33,000 in Richmond Hill. It also shows the large number of greenfield units forecasted for Markham, Vaughan, as well as East Gwillimbury. So even though Markham and Vaughan both have a large volume of forecasted intensification, their equally large volume of greenfield growth does have an impact on that overall intensification target that you see on the slide. You can see that the target for Markham is 52%, and that's only slightly higher than the region's target of 50%. And just for comparison purposes, Markham's intensification rate over the last 15 years was 63%. The market demand for ground-related homes at the regional scale can primarily only be delivered in Markham, as well as Vaughan and East Gwillimbury. And East Gwillimbury does have timing constraints. So while Markham's intensification target may seem low, it's a result of regional opportunities and constraints in accommodating ground-related growth out to 2051. Just moving on to the employment forecasts, they're shown here. Markham and Vaughan are forecast to accommodate close to 2/3 of the region's employment growth to 2051. Vaughan is anticipated to add 130,000 jobs and Markham 127,000 jobs. You can see Markham's 2051 total is just over 309,000, and that's up from about 182,000 in 2016. And in terms of employment growth by type, population-related jobs are anticipated to attract the largest share of the city's jobs at 36%, followed closely by jobs in major office buildings at 35%, and then jobs on employment lands at around 29%. This slide provides further context for Markham's population forecast. It lists historical growth by 10-year period from 1981 to, as well as forecast growth out to 2051. Markham grew by 7,500 people on average each year, going back from 1981 to 2016. And the forecast calls for average annual growth of around 8,000 people. So it's a reasonable figure based on historical growth that the city of Markham has seen going back to 1981. Markham's share of the region's forecast is 34%, and that compares to a 29% share over the last 20 years. So there's several observations and considerations for Markham's growth over the next 30 years. The city does have strong potential for intensification. It's got the 2 regional urban growth centers, as well as the 21 other major transit station areas. It also, of course, has the future Yonge subway extension that will act as a further catalyst for intensification. Markham's share of the region's intensification market is anticipated to increase. It was 29% over the last 15 years, and the forecast is for 32% of the region's intensification market out to 2051. I mentioned the city is also forecast to accommodate a significant amount of the region's greenfield growth. The city does provide an ideal market for ground-related homes. And I also mentioned that Southeast York does have lower infrastructure costs, and there's also higher certainty with respect to infrastructure being available relative to growth in the northern part of the region. The growth plan also requires the region of York to include local municipal designated greenfield area density targets. And there's an average density of 70 people and jobs per hectare is being proposed within Markham's designated greenfield area. And this target is a function of 3 categories. So it includes the density of communities that are already built in Markham, areas that have also been planned as part of Markham's future urban growth area, for example, the Bursey Glen and Robinson Glen secondary plans. And thirdly, it includes the region's minimum density target of 60 people and jobs per hectare for new communities in the proposed urban expansion lands. On the employment side, Markham is forecast to attract the largest share of the region's major office market, it's around 44%, and job growth in major office structures will be driven by growth in the knowledge-based sectors, of which Markham has a very, very strong base. I mentioned also that there's 220 hectares of employment land that are being proposed for urban expansion in the city. And in this regard, it's important that Markham maintains a healthy activity rate that measures jobs to population. So the current regional official plan has a policy goal of providing 1 job for every 2 residents. That equates to an activity rate of 50%, and Markham's current rate is in fact 54%. And the proposed urban expansion for employment land at 220 hectares, that does help maintain the city's activity rate at 50% in 2051. So one of the main themes of the region's forecast and land needs assessment work included the importance of a more integrated approach to growth management and phasing new development and infrastructure and helping mitigating risk to the region so that the region can grow in a financially sustainable manner out to 2051. And the remainder of my presentation focuses on that theme. So since 2005, regional councils have invested in the order of $7.6 billion in capital infrastructure. And in recent years, the region has been experiencing a lower rate of growth than forecasted and has taken steps to mitigate the impact of this slower rate of growth. So the region's financial sustainability is strongly tied to the pace of growth, and a fiscal strategy was put in place back in 2014, and that strategy helps manage the region's debt. And actions have also been taken through the region's budget to mitigate the impact of slower growth. So the fiscal strategy is adopted every year. It allows the region to better align infrastructure projects with actual growth and development charge, or DC collections. And DC collections are, of course, critical to funding both new infrastructure as well as paying down debt. And if the region doesn't grow based on anticipated growth rates, we will have to potentially defer the next generation of new growth rate infrastructure investments. There's a further $11.6 billion in new infrastructure that's required to accommodate the 2051 forecast. So in that regard, it becomes increasingly important to capitalize on existing infrastructure before making new investments, and to phase or stage future investments according to the actual pace of growth. Upgrades to the region's transit network will also be key to supporting both intensification and greenfield growth. And it was great to hear the federal government's recent announcement to commit funding for the planned $5.6 billion Yonge North subway extension. But in addition to that project, there's a further $5.4 billion in unfunded bus rapid transit infrastructure that's required, of which roughly $1.1 billion is anticipated to be the region's share. A list of these projects are on the slide before you. These are preliminary cost estimates, and they include extensions to Highway 7, as well as the Yonge Street rapid transit corridors, as well as new bus rapid transit infrastructure on James Street, on Major Mackenzie Drive, and on Leslie Street. So planning for growth and the magnitude that the region is planning for, that 800,000 people, 350,000 jobs or so out to 2051, and the amount of urban expansion, that 3,400 hectares, all of this growth is, in fact, it's unprecedented. So for the region to maintain financial sustainability and to properly manage this growth will require strong phasing policies in both the region and the local municipal official plans, including the City of Markham's official plan. And a phasing strategy ensures that community development is aligned with the planned infrastructure delivery and actual growth. And it also ensures that as new communities are built, they'll be supported by services such as schools, such as libraries, and other community facilities. So regional staff are in discussion with local municipal staff across the region with respect to an approach on phasing policies. And there will in fact be more direction being brought forward on potential phasing policies in a policy directions report that staff are bringing forward before Regional Council in June of this year. But possible approaches to phasing include a local municipal policy-driven approach or a more regional focused approach, identifying phases for urban expansion area in the regional official plan, or a hybrid of these two approaches could also be used. As I mentioned, there are more discussions that are being undertaken with local municipal staff. And of course, there's that report that I mentioned that staff are bringing forward to council in June. But under a local municipal approach, both regional and local policies could be strengthened through stronger criteria, such as requiring a concept plan that clearly identifies phasing and sequencing of development, with progression to a subsequent phase based on a number of factors, such as aligning the timing and provision and financing of both regional and local infrastructure, or it could be tied to a ratio of employment growth relative to population growth, or be tied to the provision of human services. Under an approach with more regional emphasis, the region could identify phases for urban expansion areas in the regional official plan, and the order or sequence of phases could be based on, once again, the timing and certainty of infrastructure, cost per capita, or the potential return on investment. And the thought was that each phase could potentially require a regional official plan amendment in order to proceed based on a set of criteria. So that concludes the bulk of the regional sort of big picture focus on the forecasts and the land needs work. In terms of next steps for the region's update of its official plan and the completion of its municipal comprehensive review, the forecasts and the proposed urban expansion that I've just walked through, they are proposed. They're there for consultation, and that's why we're having this session tonight. So over the coming months, staff will continue to consult across the region with the public, with local municipal councils, as well as the development industry. And that will all lead to a draft regional official plan, which is targeted for the fall of this year. There's also additional social media interaction that's also being planned for the public. And of course, I talked about that third policy directions report that will include additional direction on phasing moving forward. And all of the information that I've talked about tonight on the forecast and land use side, that also is being used as input in developing the region's master transportation plan updates for transportation, for water and wastewater, and they will ultimately lead to a development charge bylaw update, and that work will continue through 2021 and 2022. So that concludes my segment of the presentation, and I'll open it up for some questions. I think we've got Lily. I think Lily's is going to sort of, is that right, Mark? Going to spearhead the hands that are raised?
That's right, Paul. Mark, you're muted at the moment.
My apologies.
Okay, so we do have a question or a hand up from Peter Miezik.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Hey,
great.
Peter.
Paul, I just want to go back for a minute to the 50% intensification number, which is the minimum in legislation. I guess one of the consequences of it is more ground-based housing units. You know, you mentioned earlier that, you know, in theory, all the major transit station areas could accommodate 700,000 people, but of course, not everybody wants to live in a condo. So the benefit of the 50% versus, say, a higher number is more ground-based units. There is another way, though, to increase the supply of ground-based units, namely seniors downsizing, you know, baby boomers that are downsizing, like myself. We live in a big house, 2 people. In time that we will move out, and that'll increase the supply of ground-based units. I know that's not in any of your calculations because you're forcing 50% expansion, but do you think that's a significant phenomenon that will happen?
It's a good question, Peter. I'm just wondering, should I stop sharing my screen or should I leave it on before I answer Peter's question?
You can stop sharing.
Okay.
Probably easier to have a discussion.
Yeah. So Peter, yeah, it's a very good question. We have in fact considered that, Peter, as part of our modeling work. So, you know, we have a very comprehensive, detailed demographic household forecast modeling that in the region that's broken down by household type and age structure that sort of moves the population, you know, forward out to 2051. And that is something that we have looked at. So we've made some assumptions about how many of the existing stock or how much of the existing stock might in fact get freed up by seniors, moving out of a ground-based home and moving into a condo, for example. So we have made some assumptions in that regard. And part of that analysis was to test that 50% figure and the growth in apartments throughout the region. Is that growth in apartments reasonable moving forward? And as I mentioned, we also had Watson Consulting do some analysis on that work that we undertook, and they essentially were on board and confirmed that what we had undertaken looked reasonable from a forecast and demographic analysis perspective and a market-based perspective as well.
But Paul, if I may just probe a little deeper, the way I understand your arithmetic, whatever that factor is, amount of seniors downsizing, it really doesn't enter into your final land budget analysis. You basically have X people coming to York Region. 50% of them have got to be in non-intensification areas. And I'm simplifying it. It might be units versus people, but 50%'s got to be non-intensification. You've got a designated greenfield density of X. Simple arithmetic gives you your number of hectares needed. So who really cares how the intensification happens within the built-up area? If it's 100% apartments versus 50% baby boomer downsizing and 50% apartments, is that really relevant to the hectares of white belt needed?
Well, it's relevant in terms of the housing stock forecast, right? So when we looked at the analysis, we're getting into quite a detailed technical question here, Peter, that's maybe going beyond the knowledge base of some of the people here, but certainly when we looked at the downsizing of baby boomers, for example, it doesn't matter whether that unit's in the built-up area or it could also be in the designated greenfield area. So there are some, for example, some areas that are currently built outside of the built-up area. Mm-hmm. Built-up area was established in 2006, and there's been growth since 2006, and a fair amount of ground-related product has been built throughout the region since that time in the designated greenfield area.
Okay, let's leave it at that.
So,
thank you.
Hey, our next question or comment is from Hayden Poon.
Yes, hello. Hello, Mayor Petty and other councillors. I just have a few questions. They may all unrelated to each other, but I'll try to link them up. First of all, I just want to say that the general public may not understand what is a concession block. I would think that is a 2 by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers square. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's roughly 1,000 acres or 400 hectares or 2 kilometers, 2 by 2 kilometers square. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I am. So I'm living in Markham, Kennedy and 16th Avenue, studying at Washington University Urban and Regional Planning. So as you know, like you proposed that 50% of greenfield development in the city of Markham, roughly. As you may know, transit service is pretty poor in York Region because the York Region and Markham market is unwilling to invest in any transit operation funding and keep trying to find a so-called efficiency. I remember that one of the meeting, councillors are basically debating who will lose the most service, and then the city, I think the city of King wins by losing one entire route. So as I'm reading this book called Transport for Suburbia, I know that transit service is actually possible at just 30 people per hectare. But because the region is not unwilling to invest in increasing frequency on routes, basically there isn't ridership and then there's no revenue. So they are forced to cut service, and which is in a death spiral. So I would like to say that the region need to have more investment in public transit, not just in the capital funding of the FIFA Rapidway, but also in actually running the buses, make sure that they are frequent enough so that people will use it. It's impossible for me to use it when a bus only comes every 47 minutes to connect with the FIFA bus route. The FIFA bus route is quite frequent, but the connecting transit also needs to be frequent enough. And then here comes the question when building a new greenfield development, which is that suburbs are very expensive and it has cost to maintain. So I'd like to ask the city and the region, how much of your revenues actually come from the development charge? So if the suburbs maintenance come from like a new suburb, if the existing suburbs maintenance and the renewal costs come from the new suburb development, then there will be a time when all the roads and infrastructure in the old suburb need to be replaced, and the city will find no money for it, and it will need to increase tax massively.
Okay, so I'm just trying to sort of break that down. I mean, you had some very, very valid comments. I mean, I'd just like to make a comment about the transit service and the level of transit in the region. And obviously it's an important component of our growth. I mean, in fact, I think regional council is probably the city of Markham and all the municipalities throughout the region have maintained that in the past that we probably can't accommodate this growth and the magnitude of it unless we do have significant investment and continued investment, further investment in transit. But we have invested a fair amount, I think, in the past. I think that was something that was mentioned on one of my slides in the past. So regional council, as well as the province, the federal governments have invested, as you know, in the Spadina subway, as well as elements of the Viva bus rapid transit project. Of course, there's also the Young subway extension project that's ongoing that is also being invested in. So that investment is there and it's going to continue. It is an important component of how we grow. And it is early days too. I get the point about the level of transit service. We are a maturing region in some respects, but I think it's, so long as the commitment's there by the region, by the local municipalities, by the province and the federal government to continue to invest in transit, I think over the long term, you will see an added benefit to residents. I mean, that, to my mind, there's no question there. In terms of development charges, I'm just trying to break that question down. I'm not sure if I entirely understood your question on that. Obviously, all of our capital investment is something that we required a return on development charges for the bulk of that. I mentioned there's the $11.6 billion that are required in capital infrastructure moving out to 2051. So we will need, development charge collection revenue over the long term to help pay for that.
Okay, I would
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that when I say transit funding, I'm saying operation funding. All the investment on transit, the capital funding is very good in the region, building the rapidways and the subways. But actually running the buses is very important. If you just run a bus every 30 minutes on the FIFA rapidway, that is absolutely not useful to the residents. And also that what I want to say, the region has the 2025 service, the outlook for the York Region Transit, and they are supposed to have 15-minute service in rush hour on all the major routes in Southern York Region. But it seems like to this day, before the pandemic, there's still little to no progress on that. So the regions need to catch up really hard on the transit operation part to massively increase service to match the planned deadline at 2025. And also, I just want to clarify on that, the development charge, I'm saying that the suburb usually have a replacement cycle where after 30 to 60 years, all the roads need to be replaced, all the infrastructure need to be replaced. And that's when the council needs to find a large sum of funding for it. And if the current funding is just funded by the new development, which the developer fund part of it and the city fund part of it, and then when all these new development get to replace, and you suddenly got no funding for it, and then you are basically like U.S. cities into a deficit, and then you may need to even declare bankruptcy.
So
Right.
so I think,
Go ahead, Mark. I'll let you answer that, Mark, or provide a
yeah,
comment.
Paul, unless you have a specific answer, I think we're getting down to local city operating costs as a result of growth. But I think we'll just take that comment under advisement, and I'd like to allow some other people to ask some questions, and there will be another opportunity at the end of the next presentation to ask questions as well.
Oh, there's a next presentation. Okay.
So Lily, the next question, and I think we'll take a couple more, and then we'll move to the second presentation, and then, like I said, there will be more opportunity for questions at the end.
Sure. We have 3 more hands up. The next person is Michael.
Thank you, Lillian. And first of all, as president of the Unionville Residents Association, I would also like to say thank you to both Paul and Mark. Both the region and the city are doing a good job at resident engagement. So thank you very much for doing that. Now, my question. The implication of these proposals, if I get this right, is that by 2051, this will see the elimination of the remaining white belt in Markham, which essentially means the elimination of our existing farmlands. That would be viewed as obviously a somewhat negative implication for most residents. So my question is it possible to do any modeling by, if you like, bottoms up or doing it the other way around? What would be the impact on our plans and intensification plans and all the various metrics that we're obliged to use? Let's say, start with the thesis that says, okay, we know we've got to use some of those farmlands and white belt. What's the implication if we only rezone 50%, let's say, just to pick a number? Let's say we only rezone 50% of the white belt instead of 100%. What are then the implications on the growth plans?
Good question, Michael. In that respect, I think the first point there is that obviously in terms of the volume of growth, and maybe it's a little outside your question initially, but we're required to conform to the growth plan, as you know. So these are figures that are coming down from the province. So we really have no choice in terms of refusing to accommodate the amount of growth. The intensification target that we have presented, the 50% target, is something that Regional Council has given us direction to move forward on. A number of years ago, the growth plan has sort of evolved over the last few years. There's been a number of iterations as a result of the changing governments, but we did do some initial work on the previous version a few years ago, where we did present a number of different scenarios. There was I think 45%, 50%, I think 60% intensification scenario, and no urban expansion as well. And at the end of that, Regional Council basically said to us, no, we just plan for the minimum. And that was carried through with this new growth plan. So that's what we've done. Now, having said that, we are in fact going to be looking at, because as part of this consultation, we've had a number of questions from local municipal councils and the public, and of course tonight, and it's the very same question that you've just brought forward. And that's with respect to, looking at different rates of intensification and what the implications might be. So we are intending to bring a report back in September to Regional Council, looking at from a region perspective. We're not going to get into the details in terms of what it will mean down to the local municipality at this point, but from a regional perspective, we will look at varying rates of intensification, just to give that information to Regional Council to see if we need further direction moving forward. So stay tuned on that, Michael. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question is from Luis.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Luis Oliveira. I am a resident of Ward 1, Bayview and John area. I want to know if the region defines a framework or any kind of formula for municipalities to apply in order to assign that intensification rate of 52% for Markham. I understand that you, in your presentation, you're saying that it's a good opportunities because of, well, we have Lansdowne Gateway, we have Markham Center, we have the subway expansion north. The thing is, and those are great, the thing is about the rest, how that 52% should be distributed in areas that doesn't have a business rapid transit or high order transit, or the rest of Markham. I'm not talking about the wide areas. I'm talking about the well-established areas already, like the Bayview corridor, for example, north of Stills. Is there a framework or criteria that the region suggests or apply to the municipalities, or if each municipality has its own decision on that?
Yeah, good question. Louis, is it Louis or Louis? Sorry.
You can go.
Okay.
Either way. No problem.
Yeah, I'll start with that, and maybe Marg may want to add some further comments on it. But certainly, we actually do it, the intensification work. I would call it a collaborative effort. You know, at the region level, we have to come up with a target, and we assign a target to each of the 9 municipalities. You mentioned the major transit station areas and the urban growth centers. So there's been a lot of material prepared looking at the potential of intensification within each of those. So as I mentioned, Markham has 21 other major transit station areas. In fact, it's the largest number of major transit station areas of any municipality in the region. So the vast majority of intensification, it will probably go in those areas, but you're right, not all of it. But that's certainly where we would like to see the majority, because that's where we're investing our transit. So you want to get return on investment on the transit. So from a high level, we've done that work. We have to identify the major transit station areas in our regional official plan. So the boundaries of those will be mapped in the regional official plan. They will be mapped at the local municipal level. We're assigning specific targets for each of those major transit station areas. But beyond that, there's a lot of leeway at the city of Markham in terms of looking at other locations on where they think it's appropriate to assign intensification. So it really is, like I said, it's more of a collaborative effort, but certainly when you get into the details, a lot of that is left up to the city of Markham.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if I can just add to Paul, so in Markham, we mirror the region's centers and corridors strategy for accommodating intensification. And again, most of our intensification areas that we've identified in the official plan are on major transit routes. So it is very linked to higher order transit. However, as you say, as Paul mentioned, there are other areas of the city where there is development potential for higher density developments. It's just not in a concentrated area. There may be, a few sites here and there that are also appropriate for higher density development.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Our last question for this part of the presentation segment, it goes to Harry.
Yes, hello, thank you. So it's welcome news to me, Paul, that the region is going to be producing some different scenario analysis, at least for the information of York Council, because if you even skim the growth plan, you can't help but understand that the province wants us to have increased intensification over time. And it seems that the current plan isn't in fact conforming with the very basic principle of, but I understand you're going to do some more analysis. So I'll stay tuned and look forward to that and to any further discussion from your council. But I do want on another subject, I believe that the region is using outdated population forecasts for our growth centers. And those of us who've been following the growth center applications in recent months and years, and the new secondary plan that's evolving knows that we're seeing explosive growth in those centers, at least from an application point of view. And I think this is significant, has a significant impact on the population numbers and needs to be further analyzed by the region in determining either what Markham's population target is, what its intensification targets are, and the resulting required infrastructure. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Paul and Marg, because, you know, best I can see, you're using the older forecasts that showed more like 40,000 people and 40,000 jobs. And we're seeing numbers upwards of 100,000, at least on the population side in recent applications.
Yeah, good question. Sorry, do you want me to start, Mark, or do you want to?
Well, I think my response to that would be that it's a matter of timing and the planning horizon. So the region the forecast is only till 2051. And even though many of our intensification areas, such as Markham Center, there's a lot of capacity for intensification, and probably much more than would ever be reasonable to be expected to be built by 2051. So I think that's where the discrepancy might be. And Paul, you can, I don't think you're probably assuming full build out for many of our intensification areas, if any.
That's right. And it's a good comment too. I think Peter earlier on, as part of his first question, he mentioned that, you know, if you actually look at all of the region's major transit station areas and the 4 urban growth centers, and you look at the potential in all those locations, you know, it could accommodate 700,000 people, which is really almost the entire forecast. But you have to keep in mind there that there are really two different distinct markets. There's I talked about the ground related market, and there's the more compact high rise market. And you have to keep that in mind that, you know, not everyone wants to live in a condo. There certainly is a large segment of the population that wants to live in a ground related built form unit. So our work really tries to strike that balance in terms of what we think the demand is for the population and people moving into the region. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we do all this work.
I'll let it go.
We do have one more question. Do we have time to take one more?
If it's a quick question, I think we can take, well, if we've got 2 hands up now, I think we should move to the next part of the presentation, and then we'll take questions again at the end, if that's okay with the 2 people with their hands up. Okay. Okay, I'll share my screen again. There we go. So moving on to the next part of the presentation, and this is an overview of preliminary Markham staff comments. And before I get into my comments, I'd like to identify what the different terms used in the region's forecast mean for where the growth is proposed to occur within Markham. So this map shows the geography of the various components of the forecast. This thick black line around the blue delineates Markham's urban urban area, which is the portion of the city where urban development is allowed to occur. The blue area indicates Markham's urban area before the expansion, which took place as a part of our last official plan review a few years ago. The the red line, this red line, you see here, within the blue area is the province's built boundary. And the built boundary was established with the original 2006 provincial growth plan to define intensification. So any new development within the red built boundary is considered to be intensification. The lands outside the red line, so on this side of the red line, but still within the urban area, are designated greenfield area or DGA lands. And the DGA lands include the small area of blue lands that are outside of the built boundary. So these areas in here, as well as the pink future urban area lands. So these lands are the lands that were incorporated in Markham's urban area through our last official plan, and they're also considered to be designated greenfield area. So the brown shaded lands in this area outside of the urban area are the city's white belt lands. So that's what Paul's been talking about, the white belt lands in Markham, and which are currently agricultural and designated in the official plan as countryside. And as Paul mentioned, there are roughly 1,500 hectares of white belt lands that are proposed for urban development in the forecast. And these lands, they would, once included in the city's urban area, they would also be considered designated greenfield area lands. The areas in green that you see are all protected greenway system in the city's official plan. And most of the greenway system lands north of Major Mackenzie Drive are also part of the provincially protected green belt. So those are areas where no development is permitted. And just as another point, most of the greenway lands in East Markham, these lands here are part of the Rouge National Urban Park. So again, protected lands. So this slide provides the forecast for Markham in a nutshell. Paul went over quite a few of the elements in his presentation, but just to summarize, where Markham is proposed to accommodate almost 1/3 of the region's population and employment by 2051, reaching a population of just over 619,000 by 2051. This represents an additional 280,000 people from 2016, or an average of 8,000 people per year, as Paul mentioned. And it translates into approximately 97,000 additional dwelling units, or 2,760 units per year for 35 years. 52% of these units, or about 50,000 units, are expected to be built in our intensification areas, which are this blue area in the map. More specifically, in our centers and corridors, including Markham Center, Langstaff Gateway, Cornell, Markham Road, Mount Joy, and a few others. The remaining roughly 47,000 units are expected to be built in the designated greenfield areas, including in the future urban area, which is the pink area on the map, and the remaining white belt or countryside areas, again, which is the brown shaded area on the map. And again, under the assumptions of the forecast, all of our remaining white belt lands will be needed to be developed by 2051. Most of it for population, but about 200 hectares to accommodate employment growth. And finally, with respect to jobs, the forecast assumes about 309,000 jobs by 2051, or about 4,200 new jobs per year on average. So we, Markham staff, provided some preliminary comments on the forecast to Markham Council in April, which we've been using as the basis for our consultation. These were areas or components of the forecast that we felt required more discussion. Our first comment was that the population and employment forecast for Markham appears optimistic optimistic given recent growth trends. Second, that the proposed intensification target of 52% appears to be achievable from a units per year point of view. Third, that the designated greenfield area minimum density target of 70 residents and jobs per hectare for Markham's proposed expansion lands requires review. Fourth, that the viability of the proposed employment land expansion east of Warden Avenue needs to be confirmed. Fifth, that Markham will need to ensure appropriate opportunities for major office development in our centers and corridors, particularly along the Yonge North Subway Corridor, the Langstaff Gateway, and other areas assumed in the forecast. And lastly, we agree that strong phasing policies are critical to manage the magnitude of growth expected, and particularly for the development of the remaining white belt lands. So the next few slides provide a bit more detail on these areas of concern. The first area being that the population and employment forecast for Markham appears optimistic given recent growth rates. So the population growth of 280,000 persons in Markham between 2016 and 2051, as mentioned, represents average growth of 8,000 persons per year. And these rates are shown on this graph in comparison to historical growth in Markham on this chart. So this rate of growth is over 1/3 or about 35% higher than the average annual population growth identified in our official plan to 2031, which is about 5,900 persons per year. And it's also about 40% higher than the average annual population growth that we've experienced over the past 14 years, which is about 5,700 units per year. The 97,000 additional housing units assumed between 2016 and 2051 that are needed to accommodate this population growth works out to approximately 2,760 units per year. And that's about 15% higher than the 2,400 units per year assumed in the official plan to 2031. And over 20% higher than the actual unit growth we've been experiencing in the last, between 2010 and 2019. With respect to proposed employment growth, the average annual employment growth rate of 4,200 jobs over the next 35 years is close to both the average annual growth identified in the official plan to 2031, which was about 3,800 jobs per year, and also close to the average annual employment growth we've been experiencing since 2006, which has been about 4,100 jobs per year. But as a large percentage, which is about 1/3 of the total growth in employment is assumed to be major office jobs, the long-term demand for major office development will be critical in determining whether the forecast will be met. Our second comment was that proposed intensification rate of 52% appears to be achievable from a units per year point of view. As Paul has mentioned, the region-wide intensification rate of 50% results in about 155,000 intensification units, with just over 50,000 of these being expected to be accommodated within Markham's intensification areas. And as we heard, these 50,000 units represent 52% of total additional dwelling units that are forecast for Markham to 2051. So this proposed 52% intensification rate is comparable to the rate assumed in the current regional official plan in terms of both percentage and units per year. And Markham Council did endorse a higher 60% intensification rate to 2031 in the Markham official plan based on the growth forecast at the time. So the 52% intensification rate assumes development of approximately 1,400 intensification units per year, which is just slightly above the roughly 1,300 intensification units per year assumed in the official plan, and which represented about 53% targeted intensification rate out of with a total number of intensification units at about 32,000. And it's also slightly higher than the average annual number of intensification units that have been achieved between 2010 and 2020, which is what has been about 1,200 units per year. The forecast assumes about 75% of intensification units will be apartments. This works out to just under 1,100 apartment units per year, which is roughly the average annual number of apartment units that have been delivered in the past 10 years in a period of relatively high intensification for Markham. So just for context, 1,100 apartment units per year works out to about 4 25-story apartment buildings being completed on average each year. Our third comment had to do with the proposed DGA minimum density target. As mentioned, the region is proposing a region-wide DGA minimum target of 60 residents and jobs per hectare, but a 70 target for Markham. Although we support the principle of developing compact communities to minimize the need for more land to accommodate growth, our experience with planning for the future urban area lands in North Markham indicated that achievement of the 70 residents and jobs target was dependent on delivering a certain percentage of high density units within the proposed major Mackenzie Drive rapid transit corridor. So as the majority of the proposed expansion lands in Markham will not be in proximity to any proposed higher order transit, achieving the 70 DGA target in some new communities north of Elgin Mills may be challenging. However, it's now our understanding that the 70 target for Markham is meant to be an average target for all of Markham's DGA lands, some of which, as Paul mentioned, have already been built at higher densities. And it will not necessarily have to be applied to all of the expansion lands. So that addresses our original concern. Our fourth comment has to do with the location of the proposed additional employment lands, specifically the viability of the proposed employment lands east of Warden Avenue. Just over 200 hectares of the proposed expansion into the White Belt lands was identified for employment growth. We agree at a staff level that the urban expansion area east of Warden Avenue is likely the only remaining potential location for additional employment area lands in Markham. And it's important for the city to plan for future employment uses that require large areas and highway access. However, we would like to confirm the viability of the proposed employment expansion area east of Warden, which is shown on this map in purple. And also, given the increasing distance from Highway 404 and also the proximity and implications for the residential properties in the western portion of the Elmira hamlet, which is shown in the teal color in this map. Our fifth comment was more of an observation that Markham will need to ensure there are opportunities to accommodate the amount of major office growth assumed in the forecast. The region's forecast assumes that a large component of Markham's employment growth will be in the form of major office jobs, and those jobs are assumed to be accommodated in several areas, including business parks along Highway 404, as well as in Markham Center, Langstaff Gateway, and along the Young Corridor, which will now be supported by the Young North Subway. We strongly support the identification of major office as a key component of employment growth in Markham, but we'll need to ensure that sufficient sites are planned and protected for in the key areas of the city that provide the best opportunities for office development, including Markham Center, and particularly with subway access such as Langstaff Gateway and the Young North Corridor. And finally, again, as mentioned in Paul's presentation, the amount of urban expansion proposed for Markham represents a very large amount of development over a large geography. And if it is approved, it won't be able to come on stream all at once. So an effective phasing program will be required to ensure that lands are brought online for development in a sequence that ensures that both required hard and soft infrastructure is available as new communities are developed, and that at the same time, there's an appropriate balance in infrastructure funding for both intensification areas and greenfield areas. With respect to transportation, we expect the region's Transportation Master Plan, or TMP, update, which is currently underway, to identify any road and transit improvements needed to accommodate the growth anticipated in the forecast. With respect to transit improvements, city staff expect at minimum the completion of the Highway 7 Rapid Way to Cornell and delivery of the proposed bus rapid transit on Major Mackenzie Drive, as well as the completion of the Young Subway extension. We expect the TMP will also review the other future higher order transit routes shown in our current official plan, which may also need to be advanced, including GO Rail improvements, the Highway 407 Transitway, and Steeles Avenue Rapid Transit corridors, among others. And the rapid transit needs of any expansion areas north of Elgin Mills Road should also be examined. With respect to roads, it is likely that the region would want to improve and assume responsibility for roads that would complete the arterial grid, such as 19th Avenue, in addition to Elgin Mills Road, which has already been agreed to. And the TMP should also consider changes in mobility patterns resulting from new road and transit technologies, as well as any expected long-term changes in travel behavior for work or for meeting daily needs that arise due to technology or change, or even changes resulting from the pandemic. And my last point is again to repeat what Paul mentioned about the need for continued monitoring and adjustment of the forecasts. We rely on reasonable and reliable forecasts for a number of studies that have financial implications for the city, including the studies that determine development charges, parkland dedication rates, and any other community benefits that are meant to ensure that the cost of growth is appropriately allocated to development proponents. Among the risks of over or underestimating growth is that the full cost of growth may not be recovered, as well as the risk of over or underinvestment in community facilities and services. There is a need for ongoing monitoring and adjusting over the life of the forecast to ensure the underlying assumptions continue to hold and the pace of growth is occurring as expected. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll stop sharing now. We can now go back to opening the floor to questions to either me or Paul or any of our available staff.
Okay, Mark, we have a question from Natalia.
Hi, I have a question about noise bylaws, because intensification and increased population brings more noise, and I strongly believe that noise bylaws should be adapted to the population growth. For example, car washes are currently working until 11 p.m. in Markham. And as far as I know, in Richmond Hill, it's until 7 p.m. So could you please, don't you think the noise bylaws should be adjusted? Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. I'll have to take your comment back under advisement. I'm not fully versed on our noise bylaws for different activities, and I don't know if any of the development staff can provide an answer.
Thank you, Mark. Perhaps I can respond to that question. This is Biju Kervancheri, and the Acting Commissioner for Development Services. The city of Markham already has a noise bylaw. There are sometimes exceptions made to that bylaw for specific projects, but there is a noise bylaw, and we can certainly raise your concerns with our bylaw enforcement group to enforce issues when they do arise. Okay, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a number of hands that are up now. Our next question or comment will come from Evelyn.
can start. Thank you. Hello, good evening. Thank you for the presentation. What I'm worried is that I have been to the meetings before when they said the intensification was necessary because we would not go into the green belts and into the white belts. So that seems to be not the case. So we are going again into white belts. And what I'm concerned, and that was the reason that the intensification and the areas of intensification were projected, was to protect the farmland and for us to have food security. So now I think with the COVID-19, we just discovered that we cannot depend on other countries for manufacturing or even with food. So if something happens to our neighboring country, yes, and they decide first America, we will not have the fruits from California or from Florida. So I think it's extremely important. And I didn't see this on the presentation. Where are the food security and the farmland protected? That was one of the questions. I think, for example, all this development, why does Markham has to have more than Richmond Hill or Vaughan? Why is that like almost 60%? And I think if I understood correctly, we are going to have 100%, the double of the population without any plan. For example, like we have the Young Street subway coming up, we have all those projects coming, and we don't have a vision. There is no study for the Young Street. So how much height is necessary? How much, and I didn't see as well, which are the minimum green areas that we notice. Like, for example, we have Pomona Mills in Thornhill that is over capacity. We cannot walk anymore. We can walk to there, but now weekends, people come from all over the place to walk in the parks, and it's nice, it's being used, but we need more. We need more parks because that's what people are using. And that's something that's all over the world. People need more space outside. Even the parking lots of the community centers now, they should be like temporary gardens. And I don't know why this could not be done like it's done in other parts. Even Paris have, like, sometimes they do a beach for the people in summer. So something to think about is to use some of the parking spots that are not being used to do temporary gardens. What I don't understand, like, for example, you have like the intensification areas, and now we are seeing an increase where shouldn't be like intensification. We are going to see, we have on Lady Ghost Pub, we have Shouldice Hospital, we have Thornhill Square. And I'm just talking about a little part of Markham. Yes, we can see on Highway 7 as well, a highly intensification with very high rises, skyscrapers, but there is no plan. So there is no vision. Okay, how do we want Markham to be? Do we want to be just like Taiwan, Sao Paulo, Taipei, Dubai, or do we want to be really environmentally thoughtful and responsible? I think we need to have more in this vision of till 2051 for our children to have as well. What do we do with the green areas, with the wildlife? Yes, what about light pollution, noise pollution, and these sort of things that it's incredibly important, all this biodiversity. So how do we protect the natural heritage corridors? How do we do this? We need to enlarge it. We need to have those animals where they can cross. Every day we send emails to the city to take dead animals because they don't have crossing. So that's just one of the points. I can write more to Meg if you don't mind, otherwise I don't let anybody else speak. But I think it's very important that in this development, we also have a vision, yes? How do the planners think, okay, are we going to do like Champs-Élysées that has like a certain level or height? You have the boulevards, you have something that people want to move here. We don't want to be like Sao Paulo. You know, I had to live in Sao Paulo. The quality of life is like everybody on the weekends go to the beach or go to the mountains. They don't stay in Sao Paulo. Yes, because it's like a lot of people. Anyway, I'll let other people talk as well. If you want to respond, thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. I'll let Paul respond to the first part of your question about why Markham. Why are we looking at this again? It has been just counting. It's been 11 years since the last growth management strategy. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but it has been that long. The forecasts in the provincial growth plan have changed. The objectives or the principles or that the region has to meet have changed as well. But again, I'll let Paul speak to that. But just on the vision for the intensification areas, that's something that comes out of the secondary plan work we've been doing. And there is, as you may know, the secondary plan for Markham Centre is being updated right now. We're in the middle of that. We're preparing a secondary plan for the Markham Road Mount Joy intensification area as well. And there will be one for the Young Corridor being initiated soon as well. But I would appreciate your comments. If you would like to submit your comments in writing, certainly please do that.
Okay. So what about the food security?
I'll let Paul respond to that, just because the forecast is done on a regional. It's really a regional forecast.
Some very good comments. It is a tricky question. I think, as Mark mentioned, as part of our work, we have to respond or conform to provincial plans. So the province came out with a new version of the growth plan, a new planning horizon out to 2051. So, that's work that we have to conform to, and that's why we're here today talking about all this growth and how to manage it. And I think you've got to look at it in the context of, how wealthy we are, and big picture wide, Canada wide. I mean, so many immigrants want to settle in Canada. And so many of those that come to Canada, end up coming to the Toronto area. It's looked upon as a very favorable area to live, and Markham's smack in the middle of the greater Toronto area too. So there's a lot of advantages to people wanting to move into this area. We have to be cognizant of that. We're going to continually to see a large number of immigrants arrive in Canada, and as I said, working their way into Ontario and the Greater Toronto Area, and ultimately Hamilton, or rather Markham. So I think we have to plan for the growth. I mean, we are required to conform to the growth, so we have to keep all of that in mind. And the other thing is, within the region, there's only really 3 municipalities that can accommodate ground-related built form in terms of large volumes of units. So when we're adding 800,000 people, a large segment of that population will probably want to live in a ground-related unit. And Markham is one of those key areas that can accommodate a large segment of that growth. And I also talked about the north and the uncertainty around the infrastructure and the timing of that infrastructure. So East Gwillimbury is more long-term. So you're really only looking at Markham and Vaughan in many respects in terms of being able to accommodate growth in that ground-related market, at least for the foreseeable 10, 20 years out. On the farmland side, a very good point, very good question. And maybe that's something the Ministry of Agriculture is something that they obviously look at. Let's not forget about the Greenbelt. I mean, the Greenbelt was put aside in a lot of large parts of the Greenbelt are reserved for farming. And even when you look at the region, 69% of our land base is covered by provincial plans. So either the Oak Ridges Moraine or the Greenbelt covers 69% of the region's land base. So let's not forget about that. It's not all being paved over. A lot of it is being preserved for environmental purposes.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. Our next question is from Ryan.
Hello there. Can everyone see me okay? Thank you very much. I'm a land use planner with Weston Consulting. I'm actually here to just make a few brief remarks. And I just want to thank you, Paul and Mark, for the presentation and listening in. We are representing the owners of some lands within the area of Highway 48 and Elgin Mills. And just to provide some context, my remarks this evening are intended to supplement a letter that was provided. But just to provide some feedback, we certainly are going to be watching carefully as both the city and region undertake their analysis. And so appreciate the opportunity to provide further input to what you're doing, and thankful for the opportunity to give a few comments here tonight. I guess the first thing would be that we're, on behalf of the owners that I represent, supportive of the expansion that would include the community use areas that have been identified in the work of the region and is expressed through some of the slide information. And of course, we do see the benefit in that in achieving both the balance of intensification and greenfield development. So I'm here to simply express that support for those listening in. That's reflected in some comments that we've provided. And I also just wanted to say that we appreciate, obviously, the city and region having to grapple with a lot of somewhat complex issues in terms of the appropriateness of how much growth to accommodate the intensification rates and the approach and the implications of that. So what we intend to do is to provide some further comments through the course of the coming weeks to help support, I guess, our view of the appropriateness of the lands, again, at the intersection of 48 and Elgin Mills being appropriate for community use purposes and being included in that forecast. So we'll be looking at that from the standpoint of different land use planning considerations that hopefully will be considered, Mark, by your team and staff as well, Paul, through the work that you're doing. So those are my remarks. I wanted to contribute feedback on behalf of the owners that we represent. And we're very appreciative of the opportunity to have a meeting like this and contribute, and look forward to doing so in the future. So I will be listening in intently to others' comments and be shaping our remarks accordingly. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few comments.
Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Our next comment or question is from Alexis.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation and the opportunity to ask questions. I have a series of questions and they're really framed around two elephants in the room as I describe them. The first is we're in a climate crisis. This working towards growth out to 2051 coincides with a worldwide shared agreement that we're supposed to reach net zero by 2050. So that's elephant number one. Number two, and it's quite a tragedy that in Markham, the place with the least expensive infrastructure is where this housing is going, but it is the best soil in the region. And it's clearly identified in the agricultural system as prime agricultural land and receives the highest Lear scores in the region. So acknowledging that we're losing 175 acres of farmland per day in Ontario, which is about 5 family farms per week, here are my questions. Number one, has an agricultural impact assessment been done either in Markham or in the region on this projected 1,400 hectares of loss? Because as I mentioned, it is part of the agricultural system that goes into the Greenbelt, Rouge Park, and on into the Duffins ag system. And that system goes beyond municipal and regional boundaries. So is there an agricultural impact assessment coming? Number two, our community sustainability plan in Markham has a goal of promoting food security. I fail to conceptualize how we can possibly achieve that if 100% of our remaining white belt farmland and only a few green belt fingers are left. So what is the way forward in achieving and promoting food security if we're losing this magnitude of prime farmland? Number 3, has the Director of Sustainability for Markham been invited to comment on this projected boundary expansion? Because we have a net zero strategy that is largely based on reducing emissions from buildings and transportation, and growing our way out of the climate crisis just doesn't seem to be possible. So has our Director of Sustainability for Markham been able to comment? What about the York Region Food Policy Council? And it's busy planting season. A lot of farmers are unable to meet these public engagement meetings. Have we gone out to representatives of the agricultural community, of stakeholders, and invited them to comment on this? And my last comment is a question, but it's really more of a plea, because I'm so clearly zeroed in on the quality of the soil that we're losing here. Is there not a way that we can hold intact our urban boundary until we have established clear and specific ways that we are going to reach net zero in this city, in this region, in this province? We have 9 years to achieve our Paris Agreement targets, and we have so much work to do. This plan or proposal, it's just a proposal at this point, would lock in 30 years of growth and concrete and pavement onto what seems to me the largest available carbon sinks that we have in the city. Yes, we do have protected areas in Greenbelt and in the park, but we don't have a clear answer of the magnitude of carbon sequestration we are going to need to mitigate our existing carbon emissions and those that are going to arrive in the immediate future. Would it not be a more wise, holistic, and sustainable approach to at least address a short-term strategy of 100% intensification until we have a clearer framework of carbon budgets for the region? I think a urban boundary means that we're forced to innovate. Necessity is the mother of invention, and until we, as an industry, government, and community, are forced to treat the farmland differently, using it last instead of first, we will not understand the full magnitude of what we're able to do within our city areas. The questions that have been laid out this evening, if they're unable to be addressed in this meeting, I will follow up by written comment. But I do think that addressing the climate crisis, food security, and the fact that we're losing these vital carbon sinks are really fundamental to understanding what Markham's role in the region is going forward. Thank you.
And thank you for those comments. And I've written down five different comments, as you mentioned, of touching on various things. So I think with respect to the first and second, the whether an ag impact assessment has been done, and your questions about food security for the region, I think I'll ask Paul to address those two, and then I can answer your questions about the other sustainability net zero.
Hi, some great questions. I know we did a very comprehensive LEAR evaluation just a number of years ago. I don't think we don't intend to update that work. It's still sort of current from our perspective. The analysis on food security is something I'm going to have to take back. I don't have an answer for you that tonight with respect to, whether we're looking at it from any perspective. You did touch on climate change as well and carbon net zero. We are at the region looking at that very comprehensively. So we're undertaking a climate change action plan. We're also developing a community energy action plan that's part of this process. Some of that work will continue we have started it. Some of it will continue beyond the official plan in terms of developing some enhanced policies that will be incorporated later on. But we are doing a fair amount of work on that end, and I can get you in touch with the individual at the region that's actively involved in that line of work. On touching and consulting with the agricultural community, we do have a York Region Agricultural Liaison Committee. We meet on a regular basis. We are actually presenting this information to that group. I think it's this week. So yes, we are getting some comments from that group as well.
Thanks, Paula. And just to answer, Alexis, your questions, the Director of Sustainability is aware of the forecast, and we have had discussions. Did get some preliminary comments from him raising the same issues that you have raised. With respect to, and I don't know if Bijou is still here, the Director of Planning. I know we are also we started preparing community energy plans for some of our future urban area communities as required to do so by the region. And I don't know, Bijou, if you want to comment on the plan that has been done for the future urban area. And we would continue with those types of plans for any new communities as well.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yes, we are doing community energy plans for intensification areas. We already have a community energy plan in place for our future urban area, the expansion area, where development is currently ongoing. Subdivisions are being approved, and they are required to adhere to our new community energy plans for that area.
Thank you, Bijou. And then just finally on to your question, is there any way to hold off on urban expansion until we can figure out how to do it in a net zero manner? To me, that could be an example of a phasing policy or some kind of condition of development that perhaps the region or the city might want to consider as part of coming up with some phasing policies of how to manage the growth. So all good comments, and if you do want to put your comments in writing, we would appreciate getting them, and so we can look into them further. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your answers.
Thank you, Alexis. Our next comment or question is from Luis.
I'm wondering if that is that a new question, or is that from earlier?
I believe it's a new.
No, it's a new one.
Okay, all right, sorry, thank you.
So in your presentation, you mentioned certain trends that are happening, autonomous vehicles, and this opportunity that the pandemic gave us about working from home, right? Are you actually doing specific scenarios around those trends that can become disruptors in the way we plan, that basically is moving a lot of people in hell hour, rush hour, massive moving people from downtown from work to home, etc., and back. And we are basically saying we are planning based on transportation corridors, etc. But this, I'm hoping that working from home, or maybe studying from home, is not going to be 100%, but probably is going to could take 50% in the future, as I think it's proven that it works. So are you considering specific scenarios and looking at different variation of the plan based on that, in these kinds of the disruptors, or just looking at the trends and waiting to see when they solidify and before acting or planning?
Paul, could I direct that question to you? I'm assuming it has to do with, are you take that into account in your regional forecast?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a tricky one to deal with the COVID pandemic. It's still, in many respects, early days in terms of trying to figure out what the long-term impact is going to be. Certainly, some of the trends we were seeing even before COVID, I mean, more flex time, for example, was a trend that was on an upward curve, and it certainly has just skyrocketed since COVID's come into place. So we have looked at some of that in a roundabout way, Louis. On the employment side, we look at sector growth. We make assumptions about work at home. So we have made some assumptions on, increasing number of jobs from people working at home, but it didn't really look at the full impact of COVID. And I think, as I mentioned, it's still early days. This is one municipal comprehensive review that we're doing. Obviously we review our official plans on a regular basis. So probably 5 years from now, we'll do another update, certainly within 10 years, and we'll have a better feel for what some of these disruptors might mean. It's really not just for land use planning, but certainly the transportation system as well. So there's a lot of unknowns there, Louis, and I think it's very, very difficult to predict currently what the impact's going to be from a land use planning perspective when we're trying to manage growth out to 30 years.
Are you seeing any trending on the developer side? Like, for example, considering more space for home office and changing the layouts of the condos, etc., in the applications that are coming, or they are continuing doing what has been done for the last 20 years?
I think I'll ask Bijou to respond to that. Paul, if you want to respond as well, but Bijou's the one who sees the applications coming in.
So, sorry, Mark, could you repeat that question for me?
Basically, if developers are starting to consider putting home office spaces in the design of the units, right, of this kind. So if they are anticipating on moving towards that, or they're still doing the typical layouts, basement rooms, etc., that they have been done in the past.
Are you talking about these kind of secondary uses as part of the low density development or intensification?
No, I'm talking about that. Many people are struggling to have a space in their houses or units to work, right? Now that we are working from home. If the developers are taking that as a trend and they are starting to put the layouts in their units to support that or not.
Well,
have you seen any trend on that?
The city of Markham has already had work from home policies, live work policies and permissions in our bylaws for quite some time. I'd say 10 to 15 years. So homeowners are free to modify part of their homes, I believe up to 25% of their home, for live work purposes. So that's already been there. So the developers do not need to provide any additional modifications to the structures to accommodate that. The individuals who do want to do that are able to do that based on existing policies and bylaw provisions. Does that answer your question, sir?
My question is if they are already doing those modifications in the designs instead of allowing the people to do it. So when they do a development, say, okay, here you have already a space for a home office already designed your unit. That's the question.
I have not heard, this might be something, we might be in the early stages, as Paul indicated earlier, the pandemic, for those kind of things to emerge, but I am not aware of those kind of needs arising, and we have not had those kind of discussions with developers to date.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Next, I see a couple more hands.
Yeah, next question or comment is from Peter.
Okay, thank you for taking my second question. And my question is for Marg. Marg, you mentioned in one of your slides, first of all, my question builds on a lot of the concerns that you've heard from others like Evelyn and Alexis on expanding into the white belt and loss of ag lands, et cetera. So one of your slides, Marg, you said, and I quote, The proposed intensification target of 52% appears to be achievable. Hypothetically, if Mr. Bottomley, who's going to run these new scenarios, comes back with 55 or 60 for the region, and that translates to, let's say, 60 or 65 for Markham. I'm just using do you think that is also achievable? And I realize this is a hypothetical question, but what do you think is maybe an upper limit of achievability, recognizing everything is with trade-offs and that there are substantial benefits for intensification, many of which have been mentioned by speakers?
To me, I look at intensification, whether it's achievable or realistic or not for Markham, in terms of what it means for the number of units per year that would need to be developed in our intensification areas. And this is a theme that we brought forward during the last growth management strategy as well, is that because intensification consists largely of apartment buildings, you have to look at the ability of the market to absorb a certain number of apartment units per year. So that's why I said my comment was that 52% is achievable from a units per year point of view. So 52% will change. The percentage itself will change depending on the total number of units that are assumed, the total number of units of new growth in Markham. So if we were only assigned 50,000 units of growth to 2051, then it would be our intensification units of 50,000 would be 100%. So, but because we're being assigned so many units, that same number of units is only 52% of our total number of units, if you get what I mean. But so I look at it, the only way to look at it sort of objectively and in a comparable way to me is to look at how many units per year that level of intensification translates into. And the 50,000 units that the region is assuming for Markham translates into around 1,400 units per year. And as I mentioned, I think about 75% of that is actually apartment units. And so that, which is, I think it's about 1,000 apartment units or 1,100 apartment units per year. And that is roughly what the market has been delivering in Markham for the past few years. So that's why I say, okay, the market can do it, it's achievable. If we went higher, it would depend on what that number of, the additional number of units per year would be. If it's 2,000, if we're assuming we're going to have 2,000 units of apartment, 2,000 units of apartments completed and occupied every single year for 35 years, is that reasonable? Can the market actually deliver that? That's what I'm looking at. So I'll be curious to see what what the result would be when Paul does his scenarios, because, and I don't even know if I would be able to answer that. I mean, we'd have to get some advice on, depending on how much higher that is that, can the market really deliver that on a sustained basis?
Okay, I do know we've been higher than 52, as some other speakers have pointed out. But okay, so I think these scenarios from the region are going to be very interesting. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And we have Hayden again.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to echo with Alice's idea of having a phasing plan on the framework setting for net zero carbon sustainable commuting and transportation before we allow the expansion of the urban boundaries. My question is that on the 25% of the housing type that is not apartment, the city of Markham have pretty strict zonings. Is the city of Markham considering eliminate the single detached zoning, basically allowing the developer to decide whether or not to build something more dense, such as the middle housing, such as the semi-detached triplex or duplex, in those single detached zoning, and basically let the market decide. I'm sure the developer knows the housing need the best. And secondly, our region and the whole Greater Toronto area is basically under a massive housing shortage, and which results in a ridiculous housing price. A lot of land in the city is zoned for it is not zoned for, but it's basically a requirement to have surface parking, which is very expensive and again raise the housing costs. A lot of development applications in the city of Markham have a lower number of parking spaces proposed than the requirement. And then the staff have to do a bunch of analysis again, and then often they would say that that is appropriate because it's closer to transit, and then so it's acceptable below the minimum parking requirement. Is the city of Markham considering to focus on more growth for intensification within the transit area? I'm sure you do, but even more in the near transit station area, having more housing by eliminating minimum parking requirements so that the housing building costs can be lower, and then the developer can build more housing near 800 meters of rapid transit corridors. Just on a note, the City of Toronto is currently also doing a minimum parking study in the City of Toronto concerning the public. So I'm wondering, does the City of Markham have similar studies going on?
Thank you for your questions, Hayden. I'll respond to the first ones about the whether or how flexible, I guess, our land use designations are for different types of housing. We do, as I mentioned, our policies in our official plan, we do try to respect established neighborhoods for certain areas of mainly the more grade related housing. We are focusing intensification and the higher density forms to areas that are well served by transit. So we have a number of what we call key development areas and centers along our rapid transit corridors, such as Highway 7 and Yonge Corridor, and along our GO lines. So we have been trying to focus intensification in those areas and that in itself would reduce the reliance on parking. If the more people that are within walking distance of transit, the less need there is for parking spaces. So on the and then some neighborhoods also allow the low rise neighborhoods also allow additional units for example, in Cornell, we have permissions for coach houses above garages. These you can speak to the permissions in other areas of the city as well. And also Bijou, either if you or maybe Lloyd Chia, who may still be in the meeting, Acting Director of Engineering, could speak to any minimum parking strategies we may be working on. Bijou, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Mark. And maybe I'll just start off and perhaps Lloyd can add to it. In terms of housing types, we're talking about singles, can we also allow semis and so on. Our zoning are flexible. It does allow singles, semis, and townhouses in our low density areas. So it's usually the developer's choice as to what they propose to build there. In the low density areas, singles, semis, townhouses, they have the option to build all three types of low density units in those areas. As far as parking, Mark pointed out part of the strategy. Parking in intensification areas, there's probably less need for parking because there's better transit facilities. Traditionally, in the suburban municipalities in the GTA, developments have always required to provide minimum parking spaces. But in Markham, in our Markham Center area, one of our key intensification areas, we have maximum parking requirements. So developers can only build so many parking spaces. That would encourage developers to use transit more in that sense. Perhaps Lloyd can add to that. Lloyd, Acting Director of Engineering.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for the question. Yes, adding to what Mark and Bijou has just mentioned, the city is actually in the process of completing a zoning bylaw review and update process. And as part of that, the parking rates attached to each of the different zoning types in the zoning bylaw is being updated as well. So for the most part, the different types of zoning types within our intensification areas and the parking rates applicable to those zoning types are being reduced. So, and in those intensification areas, it's not just the fact that there's more opportunities for transit use or the availability of higher order transit, but also the fact that in these intensification areas like Markham Center, there's actually more options for different ways for traveling. So it's not just transit, it's walking and cycling as well. So that's why the parking rates in these areas can be lowered. So that's coming, and I don't know the exact schedule, but it's in the process of being wrapped up this year. And that's it. Back to you, Mark or Lillian.
Thank you. So are there any other questions? I don't see any further hands up. If there's, sorry, Lily?
That's it.
Okay, so if anyone is having trouble with the raised hands and wants to ask a question anyway, just turn your camera on and flag us through the screen. That happens sometimes. Otherwise, I will just go back and share my screen just for the last couple slides on next steps.
Sorry, can I just, sorry, it's Evelyn.
Yes, hi, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I cannot do my video, but anyway.
Okay.
I just think it's also missing with all this increase of population. I think we are, okay, start my video. Okay, sorry, I'm under, I was sent away. Anyway, I think it's missing because when you have like 100% increase of population, we have also 100% increase on services. So I think what is missing on this project is where is the garbage going? How is it going to be with the snow removal when everything? I think those practical things should be included in report, especially with garbage, as the same as we have the food security. Where is the garbage going for double of the population? I think that's important to be taught. Is it going to be sustainable? Is it going to be thinking about the climate change, about the heat waves and all this? And I would suggest if you can do like the same graphs that you do historically, how we can do in the future, the same graphs, increasing the population, increasing the units, the same way that it was done historically till 2020. That was just my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Lily, if there isn't anyone else, then I'll proceed to sharing my screen. And while I'm doing that, I would like to acknowledge that Regional Councillor Joe Lee and Ward 4 Councillor Karen Lee have been with us during this meeting. I missed them in the introduction earlier.
And our CAO has been here as well, Mark.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
It's CAO Andy Taylor.
Okay, so with respect to next steps, the region is seeking comments, as Paul mentioned, on the forecast and is hoping to complete their consultations in the summer. We being Markham staff, will be formalizing comments for submission to the region in the form of a report to Markham Development Services Committee, hopefully in June. And York Region staff will be considering comments from all 9 local municipalities before finalizing the forecast and as Paul has mentioned. Once finalized, the forecast will be incorporated in a new draft regional official plan, which, as Paul mentioned, is expected to be released for comment by the end of 2021. And Markham staff will be preparing comments on that document as well. And then the final forecast for Markham will also be incorporated in the Markham official plan, And we plan to initiate that process to update our own official plan following adoption of the new regional official plan by regional council. So that concludes the meeting, and I'd like to thank everyone again for participating, and I'd like to thank Paul Bottomley for being with us tonight to share the regional perspective. And I would like to urge anyone who has any further comments to get in touch with us directly by phone or email or online through Your Voice Markham on our website. At www.yourvoicemarkham.ca/Markham 2050. So thanks again for participating, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And for those hockey fans, go Leafs go. Good night.